Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Today on our program, climate ideology versus economic reality. And it seems even Bill Gates has decided that he needs to have a change of heart about this. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But if you think way back to the 60s and the 70s, the environmental activists of the day, with the help of lawfare, using the courts, and with the help of government funding, they started challenging building and growth in what looked like a pretty concerted anti-development campaign. Of course, the energy sector was also a big focus. The UN was talking about the tyranny of fossil fuels and the need for climate justice. The thesis of this argument has been laid out in an extremely smart article called Constraining Canada: The Costs of Environmental Activism, written by our friend Heather Exner-Pirot for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where she is a senior fellow and in charge of everything energy and environmentally related. She's a regular guest on this pod with good reason. She's smart and she knows the energy sector inside out. And of course, this issue is once again in the spotlight as the Prime Minister promises to make us an energy superpower, but leaves all the laws in place that make that difficult, if not impossible, to get our goods out of the ground and to the people who want them. So welcome, Heather. You've been traveling time zones here, so have another sip of coffee from time to time. And I want to warn you and our listeners that at some point you will hear bells ringing. No, you haven't gone crazy. Nobody's getting married. It's what happens on Parliament Hill, calling people to work. So you'll hear those in the background, but just ignore it. So, Heather, this is a really interesting analysis going back into the 60s and 70s, where this lawfare and activism really began, and with the focus on energy. But in a sense, the environmentalists have come to be hoist on their own petard.
Yeah, I agree. I've been thinking about, the elements of this paper for a long time. But it's very hard to criticize the environmental movement, and I certainly don't criticize efforts to protect the environment. But as we're all talking about, all the red tape, the permitting reform we have to do, you're seeing that not just in Canada, you're seeing in the United States, in Europe, all around the world. Then it begs the question, how did we get to this point where in the West, in our democracies, we have had, this difficulty building things. And now we're starting to see it really makes a difference, for example, in competition with China and just on our own productivity and growth. And I read the book Abundance, as many people I think have done in the last few months. And it pointed out, where some of this, from a different perspective maybe that I would take, but a very interesting one, where some of this began. And that was with the California Environmental Quality Act. And then the pieces, came together in my head as, seeing this on the Canadian side, especially with the Impact Assessment Act, that this isn't a natural state of affairs. It's not inherent. It was constructed. And now we need to look at it with a critical eye and say, is this, is the way that the environmental movement has evolved, is that serving the national or the public interest? And is there something that we should do to adjust it?
We see this still today, and I mean, there's been lots of controversy on Parliament Hill with the so-called green slush fund, because as one cabinet minister said to us in front of a Senate committee, if you have the word green in it, we'll fund it. And that's essentially what we've been seeing with a lot of different groups, and with very perhaps unanticipated consequences.
Yeah, and that was the other, idea floating in my head was, this green slush scandal that shut down Parliament for several months in the fall of 2024. And I think if you, walk down the street and ask, people if they know what I was talking about, did you know the Canadian Parliament, was filibustered? I bet one in 10 if you were lucky, maybe 5 in 100 would even know what I was talking about. But that was, and I think in a different time where we didn't have Trump and we didn't have, all the fallout, the resignation of Prime Minister Trudeau, the new Canadian federal election, people might have paid more attention to that, but it kind of just disappeared. And it's a big deal that there was a very significant increase of spending on environmental protection, 381%, the most of any issue, of any topic, that the amount of funding that went to environmental NGOs went up by an order of magnitude, and to explore, did we get good value for money, or was there, as the green slush scandal exposed, some misuse of public funds?
Well, that was one of the, like, I think about a group called Canadian Climate Institute. This is an organization that receives almost all of its money from government, and they're non-peer reviewed, and their studies are constantly cited by government because they reflect the government's narrative on that. I think even Mr. Carney said that, the carbon tax, it had no impact on the price of food, according to a study by this group. So there's a credibility issue as well.
Yeah, and so I looked at a few, and I certainly don't want to villainize all NGOs. And even if you
Right.
don't agree with everything they say or everything they do, it's certainly in Canada, you're right to do so. But some of them received a lot of funding from the Canadian government, and it was never made clear. It's not publicly available, and I searched the best I could what the value for the taxpayer was. Because there was an implication, there were examples from several internal government auditors to say that money was misspent, and that there was some corruption, frankly, and some betrayal of confidence. So I looked at it for the Canadian Climate Institute, and is not, in the annual reports, not good indication of how the money was spent, not a good indication on ECCC side. But as we all recognize, very often the government uses their research as a justification for their preferred policy. So there's certainly, I don't want to undermine what they've done, but certainly a perceived conflict of interest. And I think some of this.
I think that's the point. If people knew it was government funded, then you would take what they said with a grain of salt. But if it's presented as an independent group, it's not.
Yeah, well, and that's just it, is that it is not good practice, to have government fund an organization, looks to me as though it's, somewhere between 90 and 100% of their funding, although it's not clear from the annual reports, you can't tell. But then to not have the transparency of a regular government agency. And that's what we saw with some other funds that did receive parliamentary budget officer evaluation, to say they received all this money and they acted in a way that was with taxpayer dollars, but without the scrutiny that you expect from agencies and boards and that kind of thing that use taxpayer dollars as their main source of income.
Well, and you want to see what they're spending their money on, because as one of the key points that you make in your paper here is that this was the genesis of lawfare on this front of taking developers and energy companies and all the rest of it to court, and really demanding that there be consultation that was almost impossible to achieve. And we'll get to Bill 69 and Bill 48 in a moment.
Yeah, so and that's the genesis. So if you do follow, the environmentalist movement, and I did my undergrad in international development. This was and I joke, I used to give money to the David Suzuki Foundation, every month. But Rachel Carson's Silent Spring is really what triggered, the modern environmental movement, and a response to, the fast industrialization post World War II that obviously did have some negative environmental impacts. And out of that movement, you got Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, things that we really, we should value, and obviously had positive impacts on our society. But it also moved in a different direction. And that's where I say it's fair to say that we should be looking at a correction of, in this California Act, which was a landmark act that many others subsequently followed, gave, a clause that allowed a private proponent to sue, a private project developer. And so moved it out of, what government did being scrutinized to what private developers do to being scrutinized, but made it very easy, and subsequent efforts over the decades to make it even easier for any private individual, usually an environmental NGO, to be able to sue a project. And in often cases, this is the tactic, this is not a conspiracy, this is the stated tactic of even delaying a project meets the needs, because when you make things uneconomic, they're likely to go forward in the future. And you can see that is exactly the playbook And literally, on paper, you can see these playbooks of environmental groups to make Canadian energy and some resource projects uninvestable, to say that they're going to face so much legal delay, that there'll be so many costs, there'll be so much uncertainty that no one will want to invest with them. And guess what? They didn't. And so you can see the impacts of the Canadian economy. If you're wondering why our productivity has gone down, if you're wondering if foreign investment has not been coming, a large part of it is the legal uncertainty that our laws have actually made easier for these kinds of interventions.
Yeah, that's kind of the unintended consequence here, that they have been so successful in making the industry unattractive, without realizing that it's the industry that actually changes and makes things better, so that you do have green alternatives to fossil fuels, which is presumably what they wanted.
Yeah, so even in the case of solar or wind, depending on, there's lots of times there's environmental obstruction or concern because of effects on wildlife.
Yeah.
So it's not even just oil and gas, but in particular in Canada, it's been oil and gas. But to also look at, is this, have we created a system that makes it too hard to build? And we obviously have. And I think, some people may not be sympathetic to energy, but you see the same thing playing out in all kinds of infrastructure, and housing would be number one. And that's kind of where a lot of the California Environmental Quality Act targets was on housing. And you see that it's a lot harder in particular municipalities, usually left-leaning municipalities, that impose so many bylaws or restrictions or constraints. And now we have a housing crisis. So across so many facets, where we've made the processes too difficult to build at a cost that, the average Canadian or North American or European can afford.
Well, and you see it in bizarre ways, which even in the whole EV market, you've got cars that were made and tested in the California market, not in Canada, where it's 40 below, and they
Yeah.
don't work that well.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so just wanting to outline it, because I think
Yeah.
when you look at it as a story and see how it's played out over decades, you see that it's not an accident. And a few things also happened in the United States in the last few months. Also, obviously Trump was elected and there's a different feeling about environmentalism and about building. But some very, Obama coming out and saying, I
Yeah.
don't care what your ideology is. If you can't build, you aren't serving the working person. The Supreme Court having a ruling 8-0. So it wasn't split along partisan lines, but saying, these processes, environmental processes have gone too far and a correction of sorts is necessary. And finally, even in California, that landmark California Environmental Quality Act law being finally changed by Gavin Newsom, who's obviously very prominent progressive, likely to be the next Democratic presidential nominee, not a Republican, saying this law makes it too hard to build, forced change upon it, threatened California lawmakers of not passing the budget if they didn't pass it, got a lot of pushback from the environmental movement, but is very popular in California because people want to have houses and people want to be able to afford energy.
Well, this is while I was sitting in the office the other night and I was reading through your paper and, of course, other things. And then I get a post on X that quotes Bill Gates as saying the doomsday view of climate change that we've been listening to for decades, that cataclysmic climate change will decimate civilization, is just wrong. I had to read it 4 times. I sort of thought,
Yeah.
what's going on here? But there does seem to have been a sea change, and it's obviously true that Trump has changed the discussion and the nature of the discussion because he says stuff out loud that nobody else would say out loud or dares say out loud on the environment. But the Barack Obamas and the Bill Gateses and the Tony Blairs are coming to this of their own accord as well.
Yeah, and I think, for a couple of years we had a bit of an irrational exuberance where you just thought technology would solve everything. Solar would just get so cheap. EVs would get so cheap. This would be easy. That we only use fossil fuels because the oil lobby, pushed it upon us,
Yeah.
not because it's a useful source of energy. And I guess when you were looking at, targets in the future or impacts in the future, you could say things, and put out papers, saying, your models, what they were going to do. But now reality has hit the ground. Now you do see, okay, electricity is going up a lot. Energy prices are going up a lot. China is out competing us. We've offshored our energy intensive industries to competitors. And now we don't have these products and these components that we are seeing and feeling the costs. And the only rational reaction from a Western Democratic politician, whatever your stripes, is to pull back a little bit. That you can't ignore what's happening on the ground. And so Bill Gates wrote this great letter ahead of COP30 and has, put in probably, you'd be hard pressed to find a human being who's put more money into the energy transition in good faith.
And who's had more sway with global leadership
Yes.
as an
Yes.
individual.
Yes. And to come out and say, actually, climate change isn't existential. It will have some negative impacts, but it's not going to be the thing that kills us all. For most humans in most parts of the world, we will adapt. We're more adaptable than cockroaches. We're everywhere, and move on. And but there's some other issues that we've taken our eye off of because the climate movement and short-term emissions reduction has absorbed so much of our capital and our attention and our advocacy. We are forgetting about fighting disease and fighting poverty, which are two things, frankly, that more energy helps solve. And it was music to my ears where, as you point out, Senator, you do feel that you're a bit of the outcast, that, you didn't drink the Kool-Aid. Maybe, you didn't buy the line that climate change was going to kill us all.
Right.
And now it is relieving to hear Bill Gates say it with the data, with the experience he has, and kind of confirming what a lot of us thought all the time, that the major problem actually is poverty. And if you're not poor, you can adapt to just about any kind of weather.
Well, I think that was part of the issue and it was something that always, really troubled me, which is we were going to have to live with less and we were going to have to turn our, furnaces down and our air conditioners off and really cope with this climate that we created. But for the developing world, or the third world, as we used to call it, they hadn't even got to furnaces and air conditioners. And we were going to tell them, so sad, too bad. You're not going to even experience any first world benefits before we take them away. You're just never going to have them.
Yeah,
and that just didn't seem reasonable.
No, it's not ethical either, frankly. But basically, we said you don't get an industrial revolution.
Yeah.
And you can't have, fossil fuels, which everyone else uses for the vast majority of their energy. You can only have intermittent renewables. And that's one thing, to watch for at the G7 or at COP30. Because for a long time, these multilateral institutions did not allow financing. Where the World Bank would usually finance some large-scale infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, would not allow it for fossil fuels. And we know that they can't afford it themselves. They don't have the balance sheets. They don't have the credit. And so basically through that policy, you said you can only have the energy that we say that you can have. And it has led to very poor outcomes in sub-Saharan Africa, where basically energy use per capita has basically stayed flat, even though as elsewhere we enjoy more and more energy use. And now with AI, you're getting, again, additional benefits from even more energy use.
Well, that's the other thing. I mean, the same people that are preaching environmentalism are constantly on their jets going to conferences to discuss it, but I know that's kind of a bit of a cheap shot. But also looking at technology, which is extremely energy intensive, AI as sort of the solution to all our problems, as if I was reading this the other night where somebody that owns a Tesla, had on their license plate, oil free. Actually not. Maybe the opposite. All the plastics that are there, all the internal wiring, that we don't see that connection.
Yeah, I think if people don't pump gas into their car, they
Right.
think they're not using petroleum products. But of course, all of us do. You can't survive in Canadian civilization, basically, without it. But that was another point that Gates made, which I agreed with in his letter, was that the real solution is to reduce the green premium to zero, to create alternatives to fossil fuels that are just as good as fossil fuels for no extra cost. And that's what we should be focusing on. That's when people say technology, not taxes. That's kind of what they mean is for anything to be sustainable and for anything to scale, it just can't be more expensive than the equivalent for fossil fuels, because there may be a few of us that can afford a
Yeah.
green premium, but billions and billions of people cannot afford any green premium.
That's part of the issue, I guess, that we've got here. The Prime Minister has declared that we're going to be an energy superpower. But the last time we checked, the Climate Assessment Act, the No Pipelines Bill, Bill 69 and Bill 48 were in place. And he's making an argument that somehow we can't sell our energy to anybody else in the world unless it's net zero, unless it's clean. And I'm not sure there's evidence from that. People buy a lot of energy from a lot of people who are neither clean in terms of their politics nor in the production of their energy.
No, absolutely. So, and he used new language, in Asia, and said we're an unabashed energy superpower. And of course, the reaction here is that we still feel very bashed in the energy
Exactly.
industry. But to your point, and this is where we've made the enemy good. And again, an example, I think, in my personal opinion, of the environmental movement going too far, and not and caring more about shutting down certain industries and about reducing global emissions, is that the real key is to do things incrementally, because that's how the energy and resource mineral, industries work, and to try to make a Canadian product below the global average, so that every time you use a Canadian energy or resource product,
Right.
it is less emitting than the equivalent in the global market. And we know with Canadian LNG, that's absolutely true, that we have the lowest LNG. So if you displace it for coal, that's great. But even if you displace other LNG with Canadian LNG, you're saving global emissions. The oil sands, yes, are a heavy producer, but they have gone their emissions down, their emissions intensity down every year, for many, many years, and now are on average only about 1 to 3% more emitting than the average global barrel. But they're less emitting than the average global heavy barrel, which produces different products. So you still want to get it down for their emissions. They're
Yeah.
working on that. But to take, or any mineral product that we produce basically is going to be, the top 10% of environmental performance. Every time you add on a law that makes it harder to develop and export a Canadian product, you're making it easier for someone else in Russia, in China, something like that, probably
Venezuela, yeah, Nigeria.
with higher emitting products to put on
Yeah.
the global market. And the last thing I'll say, Senator, is with AI, and we're starting to see, people don't like the energy use associated, and we don't want to produce it here, and you want to displace electricity for manufacturing. So what are we doing in practice? That we can't use natural gas to generate electricity in Canada with the clean electricity regulations and have our own data centers and our own AI. We're importing it from natural gas plants in Texas, and other places in the United States. So we are still using AI and data that is created with natural gas generated generation. We're just importing it. And so that cognitive dissonance,
Right.
that we don't do it, then it's good. But everything we're importing is actually going to be heavier emitter than if we did it ourselves.
When you were talking there and you said the oil sands, and that triggered me as well to remember the Tides Canada group funded by Tides US that built a whole campaign around calling it tar sands as opposed to oil sands, to actually do that, to create that image in people's minds that this was a dirty product and dirty for the environment. It goes on
Yeah.
and on.
And we're all getting PTSD now that we're talking about Northern Gateway again.
Yes.
You're hearing the same arguments that were brought up 10 years ago that were never scientifically founded, that were always alarmist, being brought up again. And that is some motivation for me, I think, to say this time will be different. This time we'll be prepared. This time we won't let all that fall into a vacuum with no response, no discussion, no good faith effort to try to find a reasonable solution, instead of just trying to shut things down.
Because that was part of the problem. If you resisted anything publicly, I think the industry would be pretty direct about this. You were considered a climate denier, so you couldn't even say, actually we're not doing that anymore. We're doing this, and it's cleaner and it's better. When the media is still running the pictures of the oil sands from 15 years ago or 20 years ago, right? It
In
was
some cases,
even,
literally.
yeah,
Yeah,
quite
yeah,
literally
yeah,
of the same duck with
yeah.
oil on it. We saw that a lot of times. Okay, let's bring it up to today and the pipeline you've brought us there. So the Prime Minister is talking about a climate competitiveness strategy that we're all going to see in the budget. I'm assuming that is the same argument about the net zero, that we need to have clean product and nobody will buy anything from us unless it's there. What do you have any other insights on that?
Well, so we're all, this will be a big month. So you have
Yeah,
not only the budget, the climate competitive strategy, and also this Grey Cup meeting, between Danielle Smith and Mark Carney, which is supposed to
right,
review some kind of grant bargain. And a lot of people are, on hold to
right.
see what comes out of this, till you determine, how are we going to move forward. But the fact is, and you've pointed it out, there's no way to be a conventional energy superpower, an unabashed energy superpower with the laws that we have in place today. And yet it is certainly a different, certainly Carney's hands are tied differently from his base and his caucus, than the public support would indicate. I think the public support is behind doing these things, but
Yeah.
it's trickier for him politically. So I'm very curious how he's going to thread the needle. Some of the messaging that you've been getting is that maybe the focus will be on industrial carbon price, that
Right.
that will be, instead of, frankly, pancaking, which we've all hated, layering on all these different regulations with sometimes competing implications, that you would just have that carbon price. And there is a carbon price that I think is very acceptable to Alberta, to the oil and gas sector. It's definitely not $170. There is no market for credits at $170. There's no market for credits at
Yeah.
$100. And so being reasonable about what will heavy emitters pay, because someone has to pay for
Yeah.
the emissions for someone to get a credit on the other end.
And
And
they
so,
have been paying. Like this isn't new.
yes.
This is a bill they've been footing.
Yes, since 2007, actually,
Yeah.
in Alberta, the first jurisdiction to do it. So curious what that will look like, how they will change what already exists, and again, what else we might see removed. The emissions cap is still a proposal. It's still proposed regulations. It's not been passed. So you don't really have to do anything except for just say we're not going to pass it.
Yeah. Just turn
And
away.
that would unleash some investment and some investor confidence for sure. That would be very helpful. So Danielle
Because
Smith.
I always have to note that's a real killer for the agriculture sector too, which is a huge part of our GDP in this country.
Well, absolutely. And again, it's trade exposed
Yeah.
industries where you have to be competitive globally. There's already other taxes and laws and labor and environmental in Canada that adds costs. And so we are only competitive by our productivity, and how smart we are and how clever we are.
Mm.
And our farmers and our oil workers and our miners are very smart and clever. But there's only so many, times you can tie our own hands behind our back before we don't get globally competitive. And the Prime Minister has a goal of doubling non-US exports. And I don't know, you won't find a Canadian that doesn't support that goal.
Right.
But show me the math. How are you going to get there without getting rid of, these regulations that are obviously deterring investment in exports?
Well, that's the thing. So, I mean, just last week, the Americans put the kibosh on it, but Canada had voted for a UN proposed global shipping tax, which seems like cutting off our nose to spite our face. That we're the ones that need to ship our product somewhere if we could only get it to the coast to do it. So we wouldn't need another environmental tax on that. But as you say, the emissions tax is still in the proposed stage, but Bill 69, Bill 48, they are still there. And what the government has done in response is pass Bill C5, which is to say we can sort of ignore those bills if we want to, or ignore other bills, but we're not going to undo those ones that are there in case we want to use them. Like that again is mixed signals.
Well, and it's starting to get frustrating because the oil and gas sector couldn't be clear. We want to be an energy superpower. You need to listen to the oil and gas sector, frankly. And
Right.
96 CEOs have put together, a letter 3 times, and said these are the 5 things that we need. And and they got a major projects office instead,
Right.
which was not on the list of things that they need. And everyone likes Don Farrell, and everyone is happy
Yeah.
it's Calgary. There are over 500 major projects in the major projects inventory that NRCan runs. It's impossible that, you're going to get 5 or 8 or 11 to go through the major projects office. What are you going to do to improve the competitiveness of the other 490 that are private
Right.
proponent proposed, that are good projects, that would like to have faster permitting, that would like to get an approval? You are not going to unleash the Canadian economy, second biggest country in the world, energy and resource rich, by filtering them through a bottleneck of the MPO. And maybe it was a good short term or shortcut, but everyone is starting to repeat the mantra again. This needs to be fixed. That's not good
Yeah.
enough to have a workaround. And the joke is it only works when they're around.
But this is, I think, what people are seeing because we're seeing Canada builds new bureaucracy to get into the housing market, defense procurement, a new bureaucracy, albeit to supposedly fix a problem because procurement hasn't been working in the defense sector either. And as you say, a major projects office, a new bureaucracy. There was always that kind of activity going on in government, but now we've got, to set up a whole bureaucracy around it and draw resources out of the existing federal civil service to back that up. And what you really need is just a decision,
Yeah,
right?
everyone's begging them to do less, not do
Yeah.
more.
Yes.
And so don't do the emissions cap, don't do the clean electricity regulations, don't do the EV mandate, and bring back to the provinces what is rightfully theirs in the Constitution in every way that you can. And for most energy, mining, electricity projects, that's going to be the province. So not asking the federal government to do more, but asking them to, again, to get out of the way. There's not a law. It's a tumultuous time. There's no great place to put your money in the world these days. Investors would love it if Canada stepped up and says, we're going to be, a reliable, we want to build, you're going to get a good return on your investment. We're a safe haven. The world wants what we have. Everyone wants to trade with us. We're going to get out of our own way. The money would be unleashed.
Yeah.
And it is perplexing that instead the government is taking, this very large deficit spending approach of saying we will invest, not trying to get the private sector to invest, but
Exactly.
saying we will invest. And I just think people need to appreciate, if the government spends 10 billion on ports and rail, how much the Canadian economy has to produce to bring that excess money in taxes that the government can then spend on unproductive infrastructure. And the better move, obviously, is just to cut the taxes for that other $100 billion of capital that had to work so hard to create that $10 billion in the first place.
Yeah, it with Ronald Reagan being so much in the news these days with the ad, it reminds me of his great line, which is the most frightening words in the world are "We're from the government, we're here to help," right?
Yeah, I think we need some Reagan ads in Canada right now.
It's please, just can you kind of get out of the way? On the pipeline discussion, as you referenced the Northern Gateway, and that are we going to, is this going to be Groundhog Day and just have the same old arguments and the same old? So Alberta was kind of seemed to be suggesting at least let's look at Keystone. This is a north-south pipeline to still our biggest trading partner, and where you go with your product if you're landlocked and can't get to the East Coast or the West Coast. So it would make some sense. Obama and Biden took that offline. Is that a reasonable prospect? Is that something that would help?
Yeah, so this is a great debate, actually,
Yeah.
Keystone versus Northern Gateway. So So on the one hand, Danielle Smith would like both.
Yes, of
Ultimately,
course. Yeah.
you have to sequence it, but that would be the ideal. But really, you do have to sequence it. You can't really have both. You cannot fill both at the same time. So on the one hand, you have Northern Gateway, which has been, most advocated, and as a way to reduce Canadian dependence on the United States.
Right.
And we've been given every reason in the last 10 months to want to do that. But David Eby has been very vocal against it. Again, it's the tactic. You don't even, to just delay a project or add risk to a project just by saying you're going to block it is
Yeah.
enough to scare away investors. And the federal government has, we're 10 months, we're 6 months into this mandate. We don't know where they stand on oil pipelines. And so Energy Minister Hodgson has been very equivocal on his support for Northern
Well,
Gateway.
yeah. I mean, what he was saying
Hypothetical.
was
Yeah.
BC and Alberta have to work it out, but
Yes,
actually,
which is
it's
not the
the federal
law,
government's
actually.
job to do this.
And also that it's a hypothetical pipeline when it is clearly
Right.
not a hypothetical pipeline. $1
Right.
billion has been spent on trying to develop that pipeline. But it does so it feels like, the deal is, well, we'll support Keystone XL. Danielle Smith will be happy. The energy sector will be happy. We'll get it to Keystone. Why is Keystone looking pretty good economically? Is because American shale is peaking. Absolutely. And it was easy for Biden and Obama to cancel it when they really didn't need much more oil.
Right.
That they were swimming and even starting to export some light oil. Still always needed Canadian and accept more
Yeah.
Canadian, but just it was not, they could just, they were pretty self-sufficient. But now you can see, that by the time a pipeline is done in 4 or 5 years, they won't be self-sufficient. They will be having to import some more. And why wouldn't they just want it in a pipe from Canada?
It's
It's
already there.
not only the cheapest, but the most secure way. Not having to go through tankers, not coming from the Middle East, not coming from Venezuela. And so and also that the American refinery complex is geared towards heavy oil and can absolutely accept more heavy oil and wants to take in more heavy oil. And the guys around here will say it's an infinite sink. Whatever we could ever provide to them, they have taken.
They will use. Yeah.
And you could expect that will be true in the coming years too. That the refineries want to be at full capacity, even if they export a refined product. And so Keystone looks good economically. It looks good in a trade deal. And so I don't think, I think in Alberta, everyone would be pretty okay with it. But as a Canadian, I do think we need to reflect on two things. First of all, Northern Gateway would make us reach our goal of an energy superpower. Because now when we go to China and India and Singapore and Malaysia, all these countries that Carney just visited, we can actually sell them something. We can provide that oil. And actually, even in the Malaysia letter of intent, it said oil. So we know that they want oil. We know there's been very strong demand out of Asia for Trans Mountain, and we know we've proven that market. So if you do Keystone XL, you're being an energy colony again. You're just doubling down on the fact that what we do is provide oil for the United States.
Yeah.
We
At
don't
a
get
discount, and then they sell it in turn at a higher price.
Yes, and we don't get the soft power, and we don't create the
Right.
allies, and we don't get all the foreign policy benefits of providing energy to a partner. And the other thing is that here we are October 30th, and it looks like it's easier for us to make a deal with Trump than David Eby. And this is a
A good
precarious
point.
time in Alberta. If Alberta still can't get tidewater access, if we still can't go have access in Canada through BC to our coast, the
Yeah.
Pacific is also our coast.
Exactly.
It's not just BC's coast. If it's easier for us to just do business and double down on the United States, well, what is
Yeah.
it begs the question, what is in
No,
it for us in
it's
Canada?
so fundamental, Heather, what you're saying here, because it goes back to what is the role of the federal government, and it is to make sure that all parts of this country have access to do business and to do trade and to, support the people that they represent in their respective provinces. We've got David Eby on one hand, we've got Quebec on the other saying, never, never, never will there be a pipeline through, Quebec and all of this stuff. And I gather you would know better, but the TMX, like the Canadian owned pipeline, is almost at capacity. So we're going to have more capacity.
Yeah, and so we have a few levers, but the thing is, it's going to take 5 years to build Northern Gateway, Keystone XL. If
Yeah,
everything goes great, if we made a decision right away, we
yeah,
will run out of space, out of capacity by then. We'll probably run out in Trans Mountain in 2027. We are dredging so we can have bigger ships, so that we can put some more. They're using some compression. We can get a few 100,000 more barrels out of Trans Mountain, which is fantastic, and we'll use
yeah,
all of them. And there's a lot of opposition, so that's great low hanging fruit. Enbridge is also likely to FID, final investment decision, on expanding its main line, the lines that go south to the United States, a couple 100,000 barrels. We expect, they expect, they know better than anyone else that the market will accept it, the market wants it. And so we will have a couple extra 100,000s, a couple 100,000 barrels in the next 3 or 4 years, and we will want it and we will use it. But then you're going to get to eventually a 2030, 2031 situation where you get to the price blowouts that we had in 2018, where you had to accept that huge discount on our
yeah.
oil. We need to prepare now for, foreseeing, incrementally what you're going to hit, that in 2031, it's going to start feeling very tight. And if we don't start planning in 2025, we won't have anything to fill in 2031.
Yeah, it's kind of like the housing issue. We can promise to build a bazillion houses, but we need to start building them, and we need to get through all the red tape that
Yes.
prevents them from being built in the first place. Uh, I just want to divert for a moment because there is an argument that Keystone that the prime minister raised that with Trump because Trump likes a big deal, and he'd be able to criticize Biden and Obama day after day about how they should have not killed this in the first place and how smart he is to bring it back. But it also diverts attention from other pressures on the prime minister here at home about these other issues like Northern Gateway, et cetera, and that this kind of he thinks solves the problem politically. You seem to be suggesting that won't work.
So it solves the problem economically, I
Right,
guess, but
right.
it's the politics that are bad to me. It's bad for our geopolitical alliances. Like
Yeah,
I said, he wants to double non-U.S. exports. I don't see how you get there without Northern Gateway.
right. If you can't, yeah,
Yeah, and we want to quell Alberta separatism, uh, and
yeah.
and it will inflame it if we just have to go through the United States Keystone again, and we just double down again. What do we need? What is federation for? And then it's, there isn't a more elbows down move in a sense than saying, yeah, we're just going to do Keystone. And I don't want to poison the well. I think if Keystone is part of a grand bargain, I think that's okay.
Yeah.
But we can't just keep doing the easy thing in
Yeah.
this country.
That
Uh,
doesn't solve the problem. That
yeah, like
kind
let's
of is a
think through.
stopgap. It's a band-aid.
It's a stopgap. What are our interests? What are our interests in this country? How are we going to attract investment? How are we going to have jobs? How are we going to be influential on the world stage and have alliances with people other than the United States? And Keystone solves that short-term problem with Alberta and BC, but it does not solve the problem of what is Canada for? What is our role in the world? And I think Northern Gateway is a pretty good answer to that question.
Yeah. The other thing that we've seen this week is, some pretty chilly encounters between Trump and Carney, although they sat at the same dinner table. We've all had to do that and smile politely. Do you think that his move to embrace China, I mean, he actually said this was back at the foreign policy, the Council on Foreign Relations in New York about a month ago. He talked about China being very sincere and engaged on the climate and that we needed to cooperate with them. And it should be hinting that really this is our plan as a replacement partner should things truly, get worse with the US. I was going to say go south, but that didn't seem appropriate.
Yeah.
So, what do you think are the consequences of that? Maybe less so now that Trump seems to be getting a deal with the Chinese.
Yeah. Yeah, this is maybe the toughest question, almost a lose-lose situation that Canada finds itself. And so I won't be too hard on wherever this goes because this
Yeah.
is not black and white at all. I
Yep.
would
Yep.
say certainly at my think tank, McDonald Laurier Institute, we are very wary of authoritarian regimes, and there's a natural distrust of the Chinese, and they've earned our distrust. But and yet they are an important trading partner, and everybody trades with them. And it's almost, international relations 101, that as the Canada-US relationship becomes more strained, that Canada hedges with China. That's absolutely predictable, textbook kind of behavior from any state. And you and I are from Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
Premier Mo, Premier Canoe, both agreeing, the canola is a huge industry for Canada, but especially for the prairies. We do want that market. It's tricky. And
Yeah.
so, I'm going to, refrain. I
Yeah,
think,
no, I get it. That I
yeah,
think we're all in that situation,
yeah.
which is, I mean, when you hear one of the two Michaels, the guy who was held hostage, saying, dance with the devil at your peril, right?
Yes, and maybe it's a eyes wide open approach, which should
Yeah.
also be our approach to the United States. But I will say this, very straightforwardly. There is no equivocation between the United States and China when we talk about Canada's interests and Canada's values. A lot of us may have a problem with the Trump administration. They've not been very good to Canada, but we are still all of us have great ties with the Americans. And
Right.
it won't be Trump for forever. And I can't help but think
Yeah.
that in 10 or 20 years, it's in both of our interests, Canada's and the United States, to have a close relationship. And then at some point, we'll probably get that back again. And you already
Yeah.
see Doug Ford in commercials with Gavin Newsom and Danielle Smith and those, every Republican governor from here down to Louisiana. And you saw, Canada's favorability rating, 40 plus 48%, Donald Trump minus 10. And you
Yeah.
kind of feel like, oh, they still like us. You know what I mean? And so,
Well,
um,
we're always going to do business,
yes.
and we don't vote in American elections, and they don't vote in ours. But that has nothing to do with the individuals, right? I mean, this
Yes.
is you don't have to love everybody you do business with.
No,
Um,
absolutely. So
yeah,
I would say, it's China is definitely more of a longer term threat to
yeah,
Canada, to our way of life and to our values and to democracy. But you can still trade with people that you don't like. There can
yeah,
still be mutual benefits. And no one has ever suggested that we shouldn't trade
no,
with China. That would be, very foolish, and no one has done that. But eyes wide open, and to not take for granted, even in this very bumpy time, the relationship that they have with the United States, and that our best interest is have a good relationship with the United States in the medium and long term.
yeah. Media and like forever, we're joined at the hip. There's not a choice. You mentioned Saskatchewan, so I've got to ask. This past week, huge news. Cameco signs a deal with Brookfield,
Mhm.
a name also in the news every single minute of every single day, where the Prime Minister worked for many years. And the government of the United States just assigned an $80 billion deal on nuclear reactors. I don't know. Maybe I just don't understand this. Where was Canada in this picture?
I mean, so
Great deal.
very conspicuous that Canada wasn't there because this is a geopolitically significant deal.
Yeah,
But I can't help but be so proud of Cameco.
exactly. Great company.
What it like, just writing, masters of corporate diplomacy, came out of Fukushima, where shares tanked when they had to shut in production. How they've turned that company and that situation around in 10 years to be the dominant Western provider of uranium and now reactors. Bought Westinghouse for a
Yeah.
song after it had its trouble in Georgia with the Vogtle reactors, and now is a major source of income. Their stock has soared, but they are so savvy. And so, on the one hand, very proud of a Canadian company, in particular
Yeah.
Saskatchewan company, using our resources for
And Tim
geopolitical
Gitzel
leverage.
is an
Yes.
amazing
And Grant
CEO. Yeah.
Isaac, yeah, I couldn't,
Yeah.
no, I've never heard anyone say a bad thing about those guys, but they're also
Exactly.
geniuses in what they do. But also that this is a deal that you probably would have expected to come out of a Canada US, trade deal.
Yeah.
And around the same time as maybe we were expecting a Canada US trade deal. But obviously, Cameco and Brookfield and Westinghouse didn't need Canada to go ahead with this. It's a good deal
Yeah.
for them, their shareholders and their companies. And so it is conspicuous. And not just that they weren't there. I haven't seen an announcement congratulating, highlighting, pointing out this
Exactly.
major deal that ties the United States in this precarious time to Canadian resources for decades. And it's a big deal. And even in the media, I don't think people appreciate the significance of what was just done and what it means for energy security for the continent.
And back to where we started, I mean, everybody, including the environmentalists, are now embracing nuclear as a much cleaner form of energy, and it's the new favorite kid on the block.
Yeah, and I love it because I'm from Saskatchewan.
Exactly.
I
Me
always loved
too.
it. I loved it when it was not cool. It's very cool now. But I
Yeah.
guess that is reassuring maybe to people like you and me, maybe, pragmatics. We're all pragmatics from
Yeah.
Saskatchewan, frankly. We've been pragmatic on climate and
Yeah.
pragmatic on building and pragmatic on energy and pragmatic on nuclear. And now it doesn't seem like, you had to be a contrarian to be pragmatic about those things
Yeah.
anymore.
And I just want to say, because I know this is an issue that you care about too, but Cameco from the get-go, before there were any rules, is one of the single largest employers of Indigenous people, you
Yeah,
know.
and that's how I got into Indigenous
Yeah.
industry relations. I worked at the U of S. They were a
Yeah.
major funder of the master's program that I worked for. Went to Rabbit Lake
Yep.
mine. And I remember thinking, I think I was 25 or 26 and seeing what was happening and thought, no one has ever told me that there could be a good relationship between mining companies and indigenous communities. I had never heard it. I had never seen it. And then I saw it with my own eyes and it twisted how I thought about the potential of resource development and indigenous economic development. And Cameco, again, on another file, has been an absolute master on this, and you don't tend to hear about blockades in the uranium sector
Right.
like you do in Ring of Fire, and that's because of decades of good faith work.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we've just about covered everything, but I can't let you go until we have a final word on critical minerals because again, something we have plenty of, but we have to be able to get it out of the ground. And then when we do, we have to be able to get it to the people who want it.
Yeah,
We've signed some kind of a deal on where are we on critical minerals?
yeah. So we'll find out, what's happening out of the G7. It is an opportunity,
Yeah,
absolutely, for Canada to take leadership. I'm going to be very curious what the details are.
yeah,
But this is one that you don't find a critical word from any corner pretty much anymore. Uh,
right.
but to the point is, we're talking about critical minerals, and I've made this point before, we kind of throw out half the periodic table and call it critical minerals.
Right. There's
As
some
we
distinctions.
Yes, there are some distinctions, and as we get more strategic, more sophisticated, that I need to know what you're doing on rare earths, on gallium, on
Yeah,
germanium. I need to know, gold's our number two export. What are we doing to increase investment and exploration and make it easier to invest in gold mines? If we're going to be a resource superpower and a mining superpower, and we should be and we can be, then we need to have, smarter, more sophisticated, targeted policies for these different categories of critical minerals and make sure that Canada's positioned ahead of everyone else.
I think that's a really important point you're making because everybody just tosses it off as if, it's the magic stuff in your cell phone and something that's going to run high-tech medical equipment and save everybody's life. But there's a whole lot of a lot of the basic stuff, as you say, from gold and copper and right down to the lithiums or up, however we're going to say this. They need different strategies.
They need different strategies, and I have to say, if we're going to double exports and we're going to have
Yeah.
this fastest growing economy, you need to know what actually drives the economy and actually what drives exports, and that is gold, potash, metallurgical coal, copper, nickel, iron, and everything else is good for the supply chain, and it may be good for NATO defense materials. Those are there's not a lot of other things left that make a lot of money, and so it's just so having different strategies are those, but in terms of exports, knowing where to focus if you really
Yeah.
do want to double those exports. My God, please focus on gold and potash and
Yeah.
metallurgical coal because those are going to be our cash cows.
And that's not just because we're from Saskatchewan. and we
It's,
love
no, it's,
potash.
yeah, it's just an enormous, world class number. That's the one thing that we're the number one producer of,
Yeah.
that really matters. So, we haven't even begun to start the conversation of how we might
Yes,
work that.
exactly.
Yeah.
Heather, it is always just so amazing to talk to you because what you've got stuffed in your head there is incredible. I'm going to just recommend this again to people. It's called Constraining Canada, the Cost of Environmental Idealism. So you heard Heather lay out her argument, but there's a lot of other very good information in there that we have touched on today in this conversation. So I suggest that you go, I guess they could probably get it off the Macdonald Laurier Institute website, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's free, no paywalls or anything like that.
Yeah, no paywalls, it's free, it's get it. And Heather Exner-Pirot has written this and well, it's just you can hear from the conversation that she does her homework and does her research, so you can trust what you read. Thank you so much.
Yeah, always great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll talk to you again very soon, Heather. Thanks so much. And that is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. We'll see you again very soon as well. Bye bye for now.